Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Peak Human. I'm Brian Sanders, ready for another great episode. Go back and check out the old good ones too. Start back at episode 1. There's so many great shows, so many great guests. Usually I don't repeat guests, but today I am. Today I'm talking to Layne Norton again. He's a controversial figure in the nutrition world. You're going to have to check this one out. We may have agreed on things. We may have not. You have to find out for yourself. It's a good one though. A lot of great information. A lot of important topics, like why do people get fat and sick? How do we end up here? Super fascinating stuff. I love talking about this stuff. I love nerding out about it. I hope you do too. I guess that's why you're listening. Thanks for sharing with family and friends. Thanks for giving us a review on iTunes or the other podcast apps you listen on. And thanks for supporting Nose to Tail. So awesome to support these local ranchers here in Texas. They're doing it right. It's hard to get people to care about the quality of their meat, and people who do it well, do the great practices, don't use pesticides, don't use any extra antibiotics or any weird stuff, do the grass-fed, grass-finished, do the rotational grazing, use holistic management, be stewards of the land, helping West Texas. They don't get a lot of rain over there, and these practices really help the soil, help the land, help diversify all the species of plants and animals, and help diversify the diet so that all the good nutrition gets into the meat that you eat. This stuff is hard to quantify. Great guys like Dr. Stefan Van Vliet, who's been on the show, are quantifying this, and we're learning more about how important all these secondary compounds are and why a diverse diet is so good for the land and for humans when we get the healthy meat. So make sure you go make yourself a box today. We've got all kinds of good stuff. We got the primal ground beef with the organs. We got the pasture-raised pork on a low PUFA diet. That's no corn, no soy, organic feed. They're out on pasture. We may not do pork again. This could be our last batch, so get it while you can. It's super good. I had some tonight. I had some ground beef tonight as well from Nose to Tail. You can get all that at nosetotale.org. While you're there, check out our body care products. Beef tallow, body care. This is what you're supposed to be using on our skin. This is what humans have always used. We didn't have much else. It's called skin food because your skin eats it up. You don't want any funny stuff on your skin. You don't want chemicals. You don't want fake scents. You want real essential oils and real beef tallow that my guy Tommy collects from regenerative farms around his home. This is awesome stuff. Check out the soap. We got deodorant now. Only stuff I use. And we also have the biltong for on the go. I'm about to do my last film tour for Food Lies, and I got to take some on the plane with me, especially the liverivores. It has all the liver mixed in, so you can just chow down on some delicious sticks of meat. Super clean, air dried, soft, no nitrates, no added sugar, none of that stuff. Just good liver, good meat, and a good tasty snack. So go to nosetotale.org, build yourself a box, get it shipped straight to you. Support the local ranchers, support the small businesses that make these products with me. We're a small business. I'm just doing this on my own with Matt. We got Matt. We got Will. Will is our guy in Lubbock shipping out the meat. That's all we got. We got Will and we got Matt and we have myself. And we're doing all of this. Hopefully we can introduce Will soon on a little video on Instagram. He's out there in the freezing cold all winter, packing boxes, making sure they get to you. Other than this crazy ice storm we had recently, we are back with a great shipping record. Everything's been going well. Now that we have Will on the team and he's doing this by hand himself instead of relying on someone else like we were before. So he's doing a great job. Support us, support him. Go to nosetotale.org. And now a little bit more about my guest. Layne completed a BS in biochemistry and a PhD in nutritional sciences, honing his intellectual skills under Dr. Donald Layman, one of the foremost researchers on protein metabolism and fat loss in the world. Don Layman is legit. I got to get him on the show as well. He has also enjoyed success in bodybuilding, winning a Natural Pro card in 2006. He is a founder of BioLayne. He created the company to provide ethical, science-based coaching that synthesizes real-world experience with evidence-based protocols. In his coaching career, he has turned over 70 people pro and reshaped the way that countless people think about nutrition. So yes, he's a controversial figure out there. He seems to be at odds with a lot of people in the community. But maybe we have more in common than you think. He's really into the satiety stuff. He's into protein. He's into whole foods. Actually, he is known for eating Pop-Tarts, which he actually doesn't even like. And that's kind of a longer story that we'll get into in this episode. So I think you're going to enjoy this one. Let me know what you think. Food Lies on Instagram and other social media. Check out the Food Lies intro on the Food Lies YouTube channel. Go to nosetotail.org, get all that great meat, and enjoy this episode. And I'll see you next week. All right. Hey, Layne, how's it going, man?
Hey, Brian, I'm doing pretty well. How about yourself?
Good. Yeah, this is a long time coming. I just looked it up. We did a podcast 4.5 years ago. It was actually not too bad. Yeah, we agreed on a lot of things. Lots has happened since. We're even trying to get you in the Food Lies film. You're speaking at Low Carb Denver, which is cool.
Mm-hmm.
So many things to talk about. I want to set the table for the first 5 minutes because there's kind of a lot. But
Yep.
how'd you get involved in Low Carb Denver?
They asked me. So
Huh.
they said, would you ever, Jeff, the guy, Jeff Garber organizing it, said, would you ever consider speaking at this? And I just asked, how many bulletproof vests I needed. And, said, sure. But honestly, I don't have they seem like good people and I don't have a problem. I mean, I'm pretty confident in my own knowledge and I don't have a problem discussing with people who, may have differing opinions than me. I think that's fine. And, they assured me that like any kind of discourse or anything like that would be appropriately moderated. And I think that's the biggest thing because, unfortunately, a lot of times in debates, the person who wins is usually just the person who speaks more confidently and emphatically and doesn't deviate from whatever their kind of note
Mhm.
cards are or whatnot. And unfortunately, debates don't really tell you a lot about people's actual knowledge. It's more about like who just speaks well, which I think I do a pretty good job of. But I think laying out information in long form is much better done if you have a long period of time, um, and everybody's got like access to citations and that sort of thing ahead of time. So there's not like gotchas and so forth. But no, I'm super excited about it. Should be fun. And like I said, I'm more than happy to engage in any discourse. If anybody's got differing
Mhm.
opinions, I think that's fine.
Yeah, that's kind of what we're doing today. Although I think we might align. People think that people think a lot about people that wait. People think think a lot about people. People think that a lot of things about people that may or may not be true. That's what I'm trying to say, right? That I have some assumptions on you and you have assumptions on me, but that's maybe just our outward appearance online, or maybe you don't know me that well, which you don't. We've talked a few times over the years. And part of that is, yeah, just online. We even had, we were just like, not have the best interactions online. And I apologize for that. And I think, we kind of squashed that last week.
Well, I think a lot of times this stuff is it's easier to make assumptions about somebody's intentions or take an extreme stance from somebody when you're not actually speaking to them. So I think everybody's done that at some point on the internet, myself included.
Yeah. And people love to put us against each other too. People always tag you in my posts. And then I don't know if it's the other way around or what goes on, but I think we agree on a lot. And that's what we're here today. It's like, where's the overlap and where's the disagreement? And I don't think, actually, for the film, I've been talking to Dr. Ted Naiman a lot, and everyone loves Ted, and he actually loves you. I don't know. Do you what is your relationship with him? Do you know anything?
Yeah, I've always had pretty positive interactions. We haven't always agreed on everything, but I like him as a person. He seems like he tries to get it right. And if we have different interpretations of the research literature, I don't think it's because he's trying to push something to fit his agenda. I think we just have different interpretations. So overall, my impression of him's been pretty good.
Yeah, I think he's changed his opinion a lot over the years too, and it's more getting into your kind of talking points. And I'm trying to be open minded to all this, and I've changed my stuff a lot over the years. The whole film has been rewritten and reshot. Actually, that's why it's been taking so long. Is because I think everyone starts in this bubble, like they start in the nutrition world, and then something that worked for them they think is the only way, and then you learn more and more and you go away from that and realize there's more to it. And I think you can speak on that. I'll give you the floor for a second just on that point.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are very guilty of that, myself included. So when I first got into fitness or nutrition, it was through bodybuilding, but I had my own ideas about, what a healthy diet was or what would or wouldn't work. And for me, what I found a lot of was I would try to stick to this. Back then, it was very much like eat clean, quote unquote. Um, and I tried to stick in this rigid framework of what clean eating was. And what I found was, as a college student, I just ended up, I'd eat clean all week. And then on the weekends, I'd end up blowing out and, basically binge eating with my friends would order pizza or whatever it was. And I found the harder I tried to avoid these foods, it made it worse. So I started, taking the approach of, well, let me just control my portion sizes and still eat the foods I like eating. Account for them in my calorie or macronutrient intake and see how things go. And have always been able to be really consistent with that and have good blood work and modify my body composition as I needed. And so there's a lot of research to show that mostly if you're in terms of the hierarchy of what's important, especially with regards to body composition, it's total calorie intake, protein intake, obviously resistance training, fiber intake, but carbs versus fats is mostly just uh, an exchange of energy substrate in terms of body composition. Um, so I think I kind of had this idea. Well, this idea of flexible dieting worked for me. If I just get people to track their macros, they'll be able to eat the foods they want and change their body composition. And so I had that bias going in, just thinking, well, it was easy for me, it'll be easy for everybody else. Turns out everybody's not like me. Psychologically, I'm much more. I've been referred to as kind of a robot, where if I just decide to do something, there's not really like behavior therapy or modification. I just do it. When I decide that something makes sense for me, I just do it. And so not everyone's like that. And the same token, I mean, people will try different diets. They'll land on something like low carbohydrate, feel like that was easy for them, and then just assume it'll be easy for everybody else. Same thing with intermittent fasting. Plant-based folks do the same. Whatever feels like it worked best for you or was easiest for you to do, people just assume that that will be the case for everybody else. And what I'll say is, if you look at the physiological literature on diets, I'm skewing more towards in regards to like fat loss or body composition. If you look at that research literature, very, very consistent that one diet does not stand out from the rest as being better. What really makes a difference is what can you adhere to consistently. And you know, there is evidence that like a higher protein diet is better from a physiological perspective because it increases energy expenditure and it's more satisfying. But if you kind of equate protein between diets and calories between diets, doesn't really seem to make a whole heck of a lot of difference. Carbohydrate versus fat, those sorts of things in terms of from a physiological perspective. But adherence wise, that's what really makes the true difference. And I think a lot of people think, well, this felt easy for me, so it'll feel easy for somebody else. But what we're finding is, people, especially their individual, people always say, well, what works for one person doesn't work for another. In the realm of diets, that's not really true. I mean, we love to say everybody's different. Everybody is different, but even like one human to the next, you're 99.9% genetically
Mhm.
identical, you know. And so I think it's pretty, and there's been some studies where they have random or not randomized, but they've been put people into groups based on difference in genetics. One diet I'm thinking of in particular is the Diet Fit study, where they randomized based on insulin secretion, baseline insulin secretion, and then they looked at doing low carb versus low fat, and they didn't see any differences between the groups in terms of how they responded. And so this idea that there's like a best diet for our genetics or our physiology is not really supported by that much research literature. But what does seem to be very, very individual is what feels easy for the individual, what is easiest to adhere to. And so that's really where I feel like a lot of work needs to be done in terms of identifying that for the individual. Unfortunately, this idea of adherence or compliance is just not that sexy, and so people just completely gloss over it. And unfortunately, it's probably the biggest.
Mhm.
single variable, in my opinion, towards people getting results.
I think it's huge, and I think that's kind of what we may disagree on, because I think we agree on a lot of the literature, most of the literature, although we could talk about some specifics, but the adherence part is huge. And I think it's, if we were to wrap up our takes on things, my position is more about how people can have long-term adherence. It's better to just generally eat whole foods. And I think, I have this sort of ancestral framework, and you talked about there's no one ancestral diet. And I 100% agree. There's all kinds of different ancestral diets. We lived all over the world in all different climates and times of existence. And so, yes, very different, but generally it was whole foods, and it had animal nutrition. And it's like my crowd is more in this ancestral base where they're like, I eat whole foods, real foods. I don't have cravings. I don't overeat. And this is what works long term for me. And I think your position, you could tell me, is more that you don't have to stick to that. You can be more flexible, like you just were talking about, and that way can have your people, or you can have long term adherence by other means, with being more liberal with the foods.
Well, I think if somebody says, "Hey, I don't want to eat," like for example, processed food, fine, great, don't do it. I think the framework of eating, and whole foods is a little bit nebulous, but I think generally people get what you're saying when you say that. So I think that that's a great, in terms of a simplistic kind of message, it's a great message. And what I'll tell people is like, if you're choosing to avoid processed foods because you understand that they're calorically dense, they're hard to moderate, those sorts of things, that's completely fine. I think where the trouble gets in is when people don't really, one of the things people struggle with is nuance, and this
Hmm.
idea that like there's not black and white answers. And so I think one of the problems is, people will say, well, processed foods are associated with increased cancer risk, increased cardiovascular disease risk, all these things. Totally true. Almost exclusively due to the fact that they're very, very easy to overeat and people eat way more of them. And
Yeah.
again, people kind of dismiss this because they say, well, you know, that's just adherence. Well, yeah, but that's a big part of our physiology. Like we know that if you take somebody from a minimally processed diet to an ultra processed food diet, spontaneously they increase their caloric intake by about 500 calories per day. That will make somebody obese
Hmm.
within a reasonable amount of time.
It's a Kevin
So,
Hall study, 2019, just to make sure people know what yeah.
correct. So, I think that the message should be, hey, generally, let's try to avoid eating processed foods. But let's say you're somebody who's like a really like a high performing athlete. You play in college football, something like that. You're
Hmm.
250 pounds. I mean, you may not be able to get all your energy requirements from just whole foods. Like
Hmm.
that may be really, really difficult without some processed food. And so I think people need to understand that like it depends on the individual case, right? Like I think in general that's good advice, but it's like saying, I always like to make financial examples because I think they make more sense to people sometimes. Like, hey, in general, like going out and buying sports cars is probably not a good idea for finances, but like what if somebody makes like 5 million bucks a year and they're
Hmm.
saving, they're living off whatever, a budget of $1 million a year, they're
Hmm.
they're banking 4 million. If they want to go out and spend $500,000 on a sports car, is it a big deal for them? Not really. If the average person wants to go out and spend $500,000 on a sports car, is that generally a good idea? Not really.
Hmm.
So I think a lot of this discussion gets lost in the idea that there are caveats, that sort of thing. And even as such, like any financial person would say, hey, a car is a terrible investment. Like it's going to depreciate in value. So, like taking that sort of framework and applying it to, like, say, processed foods, and well, that's it's not really great because they're like they have no redeeming quality, that sort of thing. But if somebody like really likes a car and they can budget for it, and it makes them feel good, and it
Hmm.
actually enables them to like have that carrot on the end of the stick, where hey, I made all these financial goals, and so I'm rewarding myself with a whatever it is,
Hmm.
okay, fine, right? Like if they can fit that into their budget, but should they like take out like bunches of loans and the credit card debt to
Hmm.
buy a car? No, no. And so I think the crossover to that is, hey, if you want to have some processed food, like if you have, a pack of Oreos, like you didn't just take 10 minutes off your life. Like that's not how that works.
Mm-hmm.
But, if you're able to moderate that, great. But if if you open a package of Oreos, you're just going to be, five rows of Oreos deep, well, then don't do it, So I think if you're avoiding processed foods because you just know that they're not very satiating and it's very easy to overeat on them, perfectly good reason to avoid them. But I think the messaging, people need to be careful, this idea that they're blanket unhealthy, they're poison, they're toxic. Because what happens is when you create this idea, and we see this in studies, when you create this idea that the food is bad or toxic, people invariably, like, unfortunately, processed foods aren't going anywhere. Like, we can't
Yeah.
really, that gun has been fired. The bullet's out of the gun. It's
Yep.
hard to put the bullet back in the gun once it's been fired. And so to me, it's more about educating people around how to appropriately behave around these things, as opposed to just kind of saying, well, just blanket avoid. Well, there's a few people who maybe can do that for the rest of their life, but most people are going to be in situations where they can't just blanket avoid it. And so I think, telling people, hey, it's a good idea to mostly avoid these things, but then helping them understand how to moderate their intake if they are exposed to them, if they do have some, I think that's also really important as well. And that's kind of like my
Hmm.
message, I suppose.
I like that. I agree with that. I think it's just our different approach to messaging. And I think you're famous for like, oh, Pop Tarts. And it's like, I fit the Pop Tarts in my macros, and then, but like, I think it's just, so maybe that's how people perceive you. And that's like information that you lead with, which is like how to not have food phobias and how to like do things long term and have adherence you know, with minor deviations. And I think, which is
And
fine.
that's kind of my, like, like everybody kind of starts with their own bias, and I've just seen so many people who have developed, really, like, I don't want to say disordered or eating disorders, but certainly disordered eating patterns or disordered mindset around food, which actually can make things worse. In terms of, some people will try to avoid, and then when they cave, they end up eating way more. I remember I was going to do a debate with a guy a while back who was kind of a clean eating advocate, and he was talking about how, I mean, this was more for bodybuilding, but he was talking about how there's no way to eat, junk food and get ready for a show.
Mhm.
And so my opening, he actually ended up dropping out of the debate, but my opening debate line was basically going to be, hey, I went through your Facebook and looked at your photos of your cheat day, and I added up the calories from junk food, and you actually consume 50% more calories from junk food than I do on a weekly basis. The only difference is I just eat it when I want it in a moderate amount and account for it, whereas you have a day where you just eat whatever you want. So please explain to me how mine isn't okay, but yours is somehow, right? So I
Yeah.
think, again, like, some people try to avoid, and it ends up that when they do have it, they blow out, which is not
Mhm.
great. And then the other side of that coin is people who, like, completely avoid. I have seen people, like, develop, anorexia, bulimia, these sorts of things. And these are the things that people don't really want to talk about that much. But, like, for example, people don't realize this. Eating disorders have the highest mortality rate of any mental illness there is, more than depression, much higher than depression. And I think that information just isn't really that, people don't know that.
Mhm.
But it is a really big deal. So I really try to be sensitive to that with the messaging. But it's funny you mentioned Pop Tarts, because I'll tell people I don't even like Pop Tarts. Like, I don't know how, of all the foods to get attached to me. Now, ice cream, I love ice cream, but
Yeah.
I've never been a big Pop Tart fan, which is funny that they somehow got attached to me.
Well, interesting. I love ice cream too. I guess it's go back to the messaging. I'm on the same page as you. I don't track it, but oh, I love to eat ice cream. I have some ice cream in my fridge right now, my freezer left over from an event we had. I mean, it was clean ice cream. I would try to get like better ingredients, like from local people, and I feel better about that. But I love it. And but it's like, I guess the messaging, maybe there's just two groups of people that we're messaging to, and that's why people are pitting us against each other. Is just that there's just human differences, right? There's just like different types of people, and some people like your message and some people like my message, and it's some people that are like, they want to just think that, all the processed foods are bad and that's their mindset, and then that helps them, and then that's what works. Or like I just think there's just different approaches and it's fine. But I think we're using the same principles. Like, yes, I still do probably eat the same amount of ice cream as you per week, right? But like I don't know. It's like I think of it in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, my thing is like I always tell people like if you're not reading the captions I put on my post, please just don't follow me, um, because in a even if I do a swipe through of a post, it's really difficult to get all the nuance that I want in there. So I really I try to put a lot of time into the captions, and a lot of people don't even. I mean, I put up a post yesterday about fasted cardio, and
Mhm.
based on the comments, I could just tell that 90% of people didn't read the caption. And I think if you're really wanting to understand the nuance of things, it's important to really go into it and actually read somebody's position, um, because it's too easy in like a title or just a cover image or
Mhm.
whatever, depending on the platform you're on, to just read that quick thing and make an assumption. Or I had a post the other day where I was discussing a study that showed that people who ate one meal a day versus three meal a day actually had greater rates of mortality and higher rates of cardiovascular disease. And um, people said, "Why do you hate intermittent fasting?" And I said, You didn't even listen to the entire video. I actually
Mhm.
said, I don't think that this is a great study to suggest that intermittent fasting is going to kill you early. Here's what I think it means, but I don't think it means this.
Mhm.
But it's so funny that people will take whatever your position is and then kind of make that the most extreme position they possibly can. And sometimes those positions are warranted in terms of what people actually say and do. But I think most times people, I used to be guilty of somebody would say, "Hey, this person said this. What do you think?" And I would just react to it. And now I'm like, "Well, let me go to the post and actually read it," because a lot of times I've gotten myself in trouble because I haven't actually read what the person said, um, and then I end up having to put my foot in my mouth. So I think I think now I try to appreciate the nuanced arguments a little bit more, and I really try to include a lot of that in my posts. Like I always, if I'm talking about eating processed foods or how you could eat processed foods if you wanted, I always say, "Hey, I don't think this is necessarily a good idea.
Mhm.
I'm just saying that if you wanted to do it, or there's no physiological necessarily like toxicity to this stuff. It's more about the fact that it can lead to energy toxicity of you eating too much.
Mhm.
But here's why it may not be a good idea anyway."
I love that. I actually commented. I mean, I do long captions as well, and people always get it wrong, and I always have to fight with them in comments. I commented recently, I would pay Instagram $100 if you had to read the caption before you could comment. And it got that, and it got 150 likes. Like 150 people found it buried in the comment section and liked it. So that's how I know it's because someone just like completely took what I said out of context. So,
Yeah. And I think that's tough too, because people will say, "Well, what about somebody who makes a really false claim?" Will say, "Well, Layne, well they cited studies," and I'll say, "But did you actually go and check the citation?" Which is a little bit difficult because not everybody has the wherewithal to interpret scientific studies. But I'll tell people, I always fully reference every article I put on our site,
mhm,
and I think our current open rate on people who visit is less than 1% of people will click on a single citation. So it's like I literally could say something like monkey poo has been shown to increase energy expenditure by 50%
yeah,
and put a citation,
yeah,
And for the most part, 99% of people will believe that because they're not going to go click the citation and say, "Oh, this has nothing to do with what he actually said." So, I think that is one of the issues as well. But I don't know. I don't really know how we fix that because people follow people so they don't have to read the research themselves, which
yeah.
makes it a little bit difficult.
Well, interpreters, yeah. I mean, I guess, yeah, we're supposedly, yeah, these interpreters of the data and of the science. And Well, that's why it's good to be open-minded and change your mind and like try to be accurate. And that's what I'm trying to do continually. And that's why I was talking to Dr. Ted. We talk like every Sunday recently to just he's helping us with the film and helping us be accurate. And that's why he was like, "Oh no, I believe a lot of the same stuff Layne. Like he's right on in a lot of things." I'm like, "Oh, okay, well that's interesting. I love that." If like I've been wrong over the years. I've changed my tune, and so this is all good. And I told you when we had a call, like I guess it was 2 weeks ago, when we're making this Food Lies series, it's been 6 years. It's been a lot of work. A lot of things have changed. Recently, we're like, hey, let's make a film that Layne couldn't debunk. Like, because I think that'd be great, right? It's like if you're kind of this figure that likes to debunk things, and maybe some people it's like a bit abrasive to some, and I think that's what we've had problems with over the years is that you probably don't like the style that I approach if you even know my style, and I maybe don't appreciate your style, but at least I appreciate people being accurate and debunking things when it's due.
Well, I think it's one of the things where there's a difference. I kind of I definitely have been too I definitely have been guilty of being like a little bit too abrasive to like first time offenders, let's say. Like I think now I've done a little bit more of, well, let me reach out to this person and see what they actually believe, or see, like, did I interpret their argument correctly? um, because I have found myself in situations where I'll really aggressively debunk something, and then somebody will say, but did you see this other post of mine where I was talking about this? So that doesn't usually happen, but usually now, like if I'm aggressively debunking something, it's because whoever I'm going after has like repeatedly shown that they just don't care about the scientific research to push their agenda. And so, or like very, very, my favorite is when people like will dismiss epidemiology as garbage. But then when epidemiology comes out that
In
supports
their
their
favor, yeah.
particular agenda, they'll say, well, look at how great this study is. And it's like, well, hang on, no, you just said epidemiology was terrible. So
Mhm.
I think like that level of kind of intellectual dishonesty is something that will get me going, because it's just, I do, for me, I see what I do as like a big responsibility to try to get it right. And I usually try to present both sides of an argument in terms of like,
Mhm.
hey, here's the claim. Here's why they make the claim this way. I don't always do this, but here's why they make the claim this way. But here's why this is actually incorrect. And then I explain it.
Mhm. Well, we should get into some of these details now that we've talked about. I think we've just like kind of set the stage, and I think it'd be fun to go into some of these things you're talking about, right? Specifically, and I think one of them that you mentioned is interesting is the difference between carbs and fat, and if protein is accounted for. That's something I've thought that I guess I'm wrong about. Like in the very beginning, like I said, people have this evolution as they get into things. They think they know everything. It's kind of Dunning-Kruger effect. And the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And so I'm like, oh man, I guess I don't know. But carbs and fat can be pretty interchangeable if you account for like other things, right? That matter more. So do you want to like talk about that a little more for a second?
Yeah, I mean, if we, in terms of body composition, now some people will report like anecdotally, hey, I just feel better on low carb, or hey, I feel better on low fat. Perfectly valid reasons to do that particular diet. Like if you know you feel better on something, maybe it's placebo, maybe not, but who cares? Like just do what you feel better on. But when we look at the research literature on like body composition, fat loss specifically, well, there's the best study on this is a meta-analysis from 2017 by Kevin Hall, who's a researcher you mentioned previously. And what I liked about this study was they actually measured fat loss. It wasn't a surrogate measure; it was actual fat loss. And all the studies were either in metabolic wards where people are like housed in basically like food jail, so they can't cheat on their diets, or the meals were provided to all the participants. And they looked at, okay, if we hold protein and calories equated, they only included studies that held protein and calories equated, do we see a difference in fat loss? And the answer over about 20 studies was not really. In fact, it actually skewed a little bit more favorable towards a low fat diet, but it was a very negligent amount that I don't think is actually I don't think it's a meaningful difference.
Yeah.
But to me, what that really says is like, hey, that's actually great news, because it just means whatever you find easier to adhere to, like by all means do that. Now, it's not saying like, hey, everybody should do a low fat diet. That's not what it's saying. What it's saying is that if you like a low fat diet or you choose to do a low fat diet, physiologically speaking, you're not missing out on anything from a fat loss perspective. But if you don't like doing a low fat diet, if you find it hard to adhere to, then don't. And I think, people don't, they want something to come out to basically say all these other diets are trash and this is the
Yeah.
one diet that's going to
Yeah.
prevent cancer and cardiovascular disease and Alzheimer's and like all this, and also turn you into a sexual tyrannosaur, and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like, I mean, first off, we generally know what healthy eating looks like from the perspective of you can see all different kinds of macronutrient breakdowns that wind up with people being pretty healthy. Like if you look at these tribes across the different continents, some eat a lot of animal protein and very little plants, and some eat a lot of plants and very little animal protein. And the one commonality is they don't eat too much energy. They're pretty physically active, and they're mostly, as you said, eating whole foods. So, I always tell people, like when they'll say, something to the effect of, I think it was the Game Changers documentary. I did a very big debunk of that. And I was like, how, like, they're making these claims about performance. I'm like, how many examples do we need of people who eat an omnivorous diet who perform very, very well to just know that this is absolute nonsense,
Yeah.
the flip side of that's also true, where people say, well, you can't lose fat on a low fat diet because X, Y, Z. I'm like, okay, but how many examples do we need of people who get really, really lean on a low fat diet?
Oh yeah.
Like, there's so many out there. So yeah, I think that when you look at, in terms of body composition, calories are king. Like you can't consume too much energy. And then protein is the next most important thing, because protein increases the thermic effect of food. It's highly satiating. Most people report that they feel better satiety on a high protein diet. If you look at most high protein foods, they're not really energy dense, like in terms of the amount of calories you get per gram of food.
Mm-hmm.
And so protein's next. And then I would say fiber after that. Fiber's got a lot of health benefits. It's filling, it's satiating. And then, whatever you choose to do for breakdown for carbs and fats should be kind of tailored towards, what you find to be easy and what fits your lifestyle.
Your goals, your situation. Yeah. No, you're right there. That I think this is Ted Naiman's stuff. It's you basically just kind of like laid out his general thesis, and it's kind of what I believe too. Well, he has this protein to energy paradigm, and I think that's super important. And part of the problems why processed foods are bad is they have a terrible protein to energy. Most processed foods are a bunch of extra oil and extra sugar, carb, whatever. It's just energy, right? The terminology wise, I think we're on the same page. It's like nutrients versus energy, and I include protein as a nutrient. So actually in the film, we go into a nutrients to energy paradigm. So we're talking about protein, vitamins, minerals, and then the other bucket is generally fats and carbs, which is energy, right? And then food is you're trying to get nutrients to support your body, build your body, and you're trying to get energy to get through the day. And if you get, the goal is to get enough nutrients without overeating energy, whether it be fat or carbs, we don't even care, right? And then I think that is like kind of mathematical and a bit bulletproof in a sense. I don't know. I can pause there and ask you what you think.
No, I think that you're completely correct in terms of, if you eat too much carbohydrate, you can gain body fat. If you eat too much dietary fat, you can gain body fat. And there's research studies showing, like basically they've tested overfeeding carbohydrate and fat and found that both will equally increase levels of body fat. Now you can get into some like nuanced topics of like what source of carbohydrate is better than another, what source of fat is better than another. it's all kind of like really minor stuff when you look at the effect of like body fat levels. So for example, if we look at like different types of dietary fat and risk factors for heart disease, you might get like a relative risk increase of like 20, 30, 40%. When you look at the risk factor for becoming obese on heart disease, you're looking at like not 20 or 30%, but like 200 to 300%. So to me, yes, these sources and types and specific foods do matter, but they matter much less than just making sure that you're not eating too much overall. Now, again, I'm not attempting to dismiss food selection. It is important, especially because it can help with adherence and satiety. Um, but I think one of the things I see people get caught or stuck on is they end up like worrying about picking up a bunch of pebbles rather than just picking up really big stones. You
Oh yeah.
know, so it's like, okay, you're worried about the type of whatever, like long chain fat that you're consuming, but you're still like eating like way more than you need for your energy, right? So like, okay, these two things aren't mutually exclusive. We can focus
Yeah.
on type of food selection and not eating too much, but let's make sure that we get the big rocks first.
Oh
And if
my
we
God.
get that, then
Yeah.
we can spend some more energy worrying about these little pebbles.
I'm so on that. Some people, you can do an example of like grass fed versus just conventional. And I have a grass fed company. I'm all about it. Regenerative ag is great and it has so many benefits. But I've to even the one tell people, you don't have to buy my meat. You don't have to, you can go to Target and get meat. Like this is like the fine tuning, and that we just need to get people to just know that meat is healthy, that it's
Yeah.
fine for you, and we need to let people know that protein is good. And then if you zoom out even further, like let's just get people to start not like caring about food in general and not eating too much. And yes, like you said, satiety, there's so many other factors that go along with the protein and their what food they're eating. That's the most important part, is a super high level of like, you shouldn't be, well, maybe some people can care about this stuff, but you shouldn't be caring about all this stuff until you're doing the big things of like getting your nutrient to energy balance in check, of like, I'm not eating too much energy is basically what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, the number of people I see him and haw over little details, but then don't even go exercise consistently, I'm kind of like, okay, the details, they can matter, but like also go move. Like
Yeah.
that's, like one of the most powerful things you can do for your health. And, you've got people like, doing multiple cold plunges per day and, red light, infrared light, sauna, and all this kind of stuff. And then it's like, okay, maybe that stuff makes a little bit of a difference, but like, those things are like, the scalpel. Exercise is like the sledgehammer. Like, if you need
True,
to
true.
like actually break up some rubble, you need a sledgehammer. You don't need a scalpel. Now, the scalpel might help with refinements, but you still need to use the sledgehammer in terms of like where you're getting your most bang for your buck. So, I am on board there in terms of like, again, like details are fine. I think it's fine to talk about them, but let's make sure that we get the messaging straight with, hey, here's the most important stuff. And then when you've got this in check, then you can spend energy on some of this other stuff. Because, I mean, I was actually talking about this with a friend the other day about self development, but I think it applies to other stuff too. I'm like, I've seen people who have like gotten so caught up in self development that they're spending like 4 or 5 hours a day on it.
Hmm.
And I'm like, okay, but like, when are you going to have time to actually go like fix stuff?
Do it.
Like
Yeah.
actually go make these improvements and implement them. Like I'll take an implementer over a planner any day, you know, like just go do the stuff. Like if I know something's broken, I don't need to read 5 books about it. Let me just go
Do it.
not break stuff
Yeah.
anymore, you know?
Oh, I'm big into that. The biggest things is start eating more protein and real foods and move. And like once you do all that, I tell people all the time, spend all your effort on that. Spend all your effort. And if you can actually do that and you're actually doing that consistently, then you can start wearing the blue blocking glasses or whatever you want to do. I'm not into all that biohacking stuff. Maybe people lump me into people who do that stuff. I mean, I love to do a sauna. I mean, it's great. Yeah. But
I like
it's not
sauna
like,
too.
yeah, it's great. I just like, it's just fun. It has nothing to do with me being a biohacker, really. It's just these details. But then there's a whole crowd for those, right? There's a whole crowd of people that have done all the things, and now they're looking to fine tune, and that's fantastic. And people should
Yeah,
do that.
yeah. But my thing would be something like, people doing, cold plunge twice a day, meditating, I don't know, sunning their backsides, all this kind of stuff. And it's like, but you're not like taking time to meal prep or, like get out and exercise and that sort of thing. Like, okay, you've only got so much time in your day, and this goes for everybody, right? I think most of us, we have to create some kind of income one way or another. So that's a bucket that you have to spend time on. We have to do things that, quote unquote, fill up our cup, whatever that looks like for a person. Most of us have either friends or family time, right? And so once you start getting through all those, like you get down to like you've only got so much time in the day. So when it comes to our health and wellness, like where are we going to put that time and energy? And I just want to make sure that people are, placing it in the appropriate, pulling the appropriate levers that are going to get them the biggest bang for their buck. And I think a lot of my big worry is that, you know, based on the messaging that's out in social media and, oh, don't drink things out of this container because it's got this chemical in it, or,
Mm-hmm.
don't have this food because it's got this thing in it. My big concern is people get so caught up in these little details that they don't really know how to grade like what's really important versus not. And so then they think everything's important, and a lot of people end up just not doing anything to make lifestyle behavior modification because they say, well, I don't want to do low carb because over here this person says, well, low carb raises your LDL and XYZ. And another person, well, I don't want to do low fat because everybody says, well, you can't burn fat if you're eating high carb.
Yeah.
And then I want to do intermittent fasting, but then this person says, don't eat for the. So
Yeah.
it's like there's so much mixed messaging to the individual that it feels very overwhelming. And a lot of people end up doing absolutely nothing because they feel like, well, no matter what I do, it's going to be wrong.
Mm.
So I think what I try to do and really emphasize is like, hey, the barrier to entry to getting healthy is actually not that high. Like there's a few big levers you can pull to make a large difference, and then worry about these details, which by the way, most of them don't even matter that much.
Mm-hmm.
So I think like that's the messaging I try to get across.
No, and that's fine. And I don't want to speak on both sides of my mouth because I do care about some of the small things, and I like to do them. But I also am totally in agreement. You got to look at that 80%, the 80% rule. Do those giant things, absolutely. But I also do have content and messaging around doing the other stuff too. So I don't want to just like sit here and agree with everything you're saying. I do think that those are good, or you know what I mean, and maybe you don't, and I don't know. Like
Well, no, I mean, like if I'm going to do a post about something that I feel is like superfluous, right? So I'll do posts every once in a while about different supplements, and I always will say, like, listen, this works. Here's how much I think it works. Here's kind of the effect in terms of like how meaningful it is. Now, just to put this in perspective, this works, but here's what exercise does, right? Or here's what nutrition does, or, that sort of thing. Just framing it appropriately so people understand, okay, this supplement isn't going to change my life, but it may have some benefit to it.
yeah.
Um, but just making sure it's framed appropriately, because again, people don't have an idea. If you say, significantly increases muscle mass, well, significantly sounds a lot different in terms of the absolute amount for one person versus another, right? And I just want to make sure people have that information. And the other thing is too is when it comes to that kind of stuff, people are really good. I think the joke is 99% of statistics are made up on the spot or something like that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I mean, you'll see messages like increase fat loss by 500% or
Yeah.
something like that. Well, if you go look at the study, there actually wasn't any meaningful difference in fat loss. It was zero point 0.1 kilogram versus 0.5 kilogram, which technically is 500% different,
Yeah.
but neither of which was statistically significant. So, I think unfortunately, like, people, I'm not really sure how to fix that issue, because it really would require that people have be much more scientifically literate,
Mm-hmm.
and obviously like that's not a reasonable expectation for everybody. So
Mm-hmm.
it's really really tough, and I think a lot of this has like boiled over from COVID, or maybe COVID just exposed this, which is everything's so polarizing now that people can't, like, there's no way, like the extreme, take an extreme plant-based thing like the game changers, right? It's like nothing about meat could possibly have redeeming qualities, period. It's
Yeah.
toxic, any amount of it's bad, so on and so forth. And I'm again, like, I'm not on board with that, and I did a whole like 50-page debunk of that
Uh-huh.
POS. But then by the other token, you have like some carnivore advocates go, well, plants have defense chemicals that are toxic, and it's like, well, that's also insanity as well. And so I think it's so. I think the point I'm making is when you get into these entrenched positions, and it becomes impossible for you to acknowledge that any other way other than your way has any benefits at all. I mean, now we're just talking about dogma and religion as opposed to, like actually having discourse. And I think one of the reasons a lot of people don't like me is I actually don't care what group you're in,
Mm-hmm.
because I call everybody out when they
Mm-hmm.
say nonsense, and I think that gets me a lot of heat from all sides. But I think it's also very important to, like, for me to say, hey, here's the good aspect to this. This has validity. Also, this part of it's trash.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. I think people just don't like, to be frank, people don't like that you are the arbiter of truth. I think that's what people are pushing back on. I like to call out everyone too, but I think maybe that's what they're pushing back on, is that, well, so you're the king of everything? Uh-huh.
I, I think for me, certainly, have I gotten things wrong? Sure. I think most of the things that I've gotten wrong over the course of my career, I didn't have super strong positions on to begin with. Um, but I'll also say, like, when I feel like I've been shown enough evidence to show me an opposing viewpoint may have been correct, I'll just say, hey, it looks like I got this wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, to your point, I'm not the arbiter of truth. Um, what I do try to do is be intellectually honest in terms of, hey, here's what the research data says. Here's what I think, regardless of my bias. I mean, I'll present studies all the time on my YouTube channel where I'm like, well, I was kind of surprised at this finding. Here's what I think it means.
Mm-hmm.
It goes against what I think is the fact, but you know, it's one study. I'm not going to get crazy about one study, but I'm certainly going to pay attention in terms of what happens. A great example of this is artificial sweeteners. I've been somebody who's been a pro artificial sweetener person, which is actually a mischaracterization of my position. But there's enough studies now where I've said, hey, it looks like they're not inert in terms of some of these artificial sweeteners, like sucralose, and I think it was stevia, had do seem to change some of the gut microflora.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what I've said is, hey, I don't know if that change is good or bad or neutral. That's what we don't know. And I could get down that rabbit hole as well in terms of some of the stuff they found. But the point being is, like, hey, I'm not sitting here still beating that drum of, hey, these things don't do anything bad. There's no possible downsides. I'm like, okay, it looks like they do something. We just don't know, is that a net negative in terms of like gut health and those sorts of things. So, like, I am willing to adapt my position as the new evidence comes out. And does it make me the arbiter of truth? No, but I think it makes me a better advocate for truth than most people out there who aren't willing to admit when they are wrong.
Mm. Oh, that's fine. Yeah, and I think my position, I'm kind of just like trying to think of my position. My general position is that natural foods are better in general. That's my bias, is that natural foods that we've eaten forever are better. So yes, I'm naturally skeptical of artificial sweeteners, even if there's a million studies showing, hey, these people ate it, they lost weight because they drank diet soda, they drank fewer calories. That's good. I'm like, yeah, but what about long term? I'm just always skeptical of that type of stuff. And yes, I guess I'll admit that's my bias, is that I will always err on the side of eating whole foods and being skeptical of the new foods. And to go. Well, okay.
No, the one pushback I'd have on that is, how much evidence would you need to see to be comfortable with it? And if there's not an objective endpoint to that, then it's kind of like, okay, you just kind of have to admit that that's a belief rather than anything based in fact or logic, and that's also okay. I'll tell people like, hey, have your beliefs. Like if you're somebody who says I don't trust artificial stuff,
Yeah.
that's fine. My issue becomes when people make claims around that and say, well, these things have to be bad for you, X, Y, Z. If you just say, hey, me personally, I don't consume them because I just try to stick
I
to
think it's
whole
that. Yeah.
foods and
Well,
what's quote unquote natural. I've got no problem with that. I think again, it boils down to the messaging.
okay. Well, this brings up a good point of what science can be done. There's only so much science that can be done. And I think a lot of my beliefs as well, and I will call them beliefs, is that there's like the long-term data. It's a lot of thought experiments you have to do to really think of like how can I be optimal long term? And we can't know. There is no study we can do to put someone in a metabolic ward for 50 years, 70
Right.
years. Like this is impossible stuff. So it's like thought experiments. Like I'd love to do some of these thought experiments. Like, okay, what if someone ate whole foods? Like there's no study, but if someone ate good quality meat, whatever, just like good quality protein, I mean, which should be from animal foods, they ate whatever carbs, fats from whole foods, I think generally they would be naturally having satiety, like you're saying, naturally eat the right amount and naturally be healthy long term. But someone will say, oh, well, there's no study that shows that. I'm like, well, I don't know. There's human history. There's like all these tribes you mentioned that are free of most diseases. They kind of live long and live well. And, I visited them. That's why I went to visit the Hadza, the Maasai, the Pygmies 2 years ago. We asked them all these questions like, do you have back pain? They're like, nah, what are you talking about? And we kept asking them because they're like, no, we don't have back pain. And they're like, oh, yeah, yeah. Like this guy fell out of a tree and he had some back pain. And we're like, no, 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 no. Like, do older people have back pain? They're like, no. Do they have this? They have no. They don't seem to have a lot of these problems. Some of them are getting processed foods, and I think they're like being infiltrated by these types of things, and then they are having problems, and you can see their teeth going bad. Like it's one of the first signs of health. So I think there's like, would you agree on these long term thought experiments on that we can't study everything? Like, kind of, what is the limitations of studies? I don't like people that hide. I call it hiding behind evidence based medicine. Right? It's just like, well, it's not in the literature. I'm like, well, we're never going to get everything in the literature.
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's fine to have thoughts about things that haven't been studied or there's no research literature. I think the important thing is to say, hey, there's no literature on this, but here's my thought experiment or here's what I believe. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's fine. Like I do that all the time. Like, hey, there's no particular literature on this. Here's what I've observed and here's what I personally do or here's what I believe. I think that's fine to say. But I think the messaging I typically see is people kind of make it out to be here. There is hard science to show what I believe, and it's like, well, no, there's not. It's fine to say that there's not.
Mm-hmm.
You make a great point in terms of like, and I'll be the first person to say like, it's very very hard to do good nutrition research, and we kind of have to synthesize a bunch of stuff together. And the reason that is food is not just food. Food is culture. Food is sociological. Food is psychological. Food is economical. There's a lot of inputs that influence the things we eat, right down to like social setting, environmental cues,
Mm-hmm.
even like plate color and size influence how much we eat. So this idea that that we can study nutrition accurately, we can. I think we can get like general good recommendations, like we talked about, like consume minimally processed foods, control your energy intake, protein seems to be beneficial, fiber.
Mm-hmm.
Those are pretty consistent in the literature. But like for example, red meat. Okay, well there are studies showing increased risk of colorectal cancer and cardiovascular disease and whatnot. But there's also studies showing that it doesn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so and then when you look at the hazard ratios or the relative risk, they're really not that large. Um, and so, is there an effect? Maybe, maybe not. I think that it's difficult to pick this stuff out, because if you're really trying to do the gold standard of research, well, that's a randomized control trial. But you can't do a 10-year randomized control trial. It's just not possible. Like a great example, like, people have really poor adherence in dietary studies. So if you're trying to get people like past 6 months, people don't adhere. So you would have to basically like have people agree to have whatever they eat controlled for a long period of time. Because if we're looking at diseases, like let's take cardiovascular disease, for example, cardiovascular disease develops over decades. That's not something that you, like if you do a 2-year study, I mean, if you're doing it in people in their 60s, yeah, there'll be some people who have cardiovascular disease events, but it's going to be a relatively small percentage of the people who are in the study. And so, it's hard to do randomized control trials on these sorts of disease states. And so what we're left with, actually, sorry, a great example of why it's so hard to do that long of a randomization is the more control you exert over people, the more you have to pay them. And, and people don't realize this. Yes. So these people who do scientific studies, they're people like you and me. They have lives, they have families. Like if you're going to control everything they do, they're going to want to get paid for it. So for example, NASA was going to do a 70-day study of bed rest. All right, all people were going to do was lay in bed for 70 days. They were paying $18,000 for 70 days. Because while laying in bed for a few days might sound appetizing, I promise you, once you get to day 3, you're going to be ready to get out.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And so if you're going to do that, you're going to have to provide, an incentive for them to do it. So if you want to do a 10-year randomized control trial where you're controlling everything they eat, I mean, you're going to have to pay people tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, and there's no money for that.
Yeah.
Then what are we left with if we want to see, like, now in short-term randomized control trials, you can look at markers. You can look at markers of health, but those are surrogate markers. You can't necessarily draw hard conclusions from those. So what we're left with, our best stuff, is cohort studies where they track people over, a 10, 20-year period, 5 to, depending on however long you want to track them, and look at, okay, how many of these people do develop diseases, and then let's stratify them based on whatever metric you want to look at, meat intake, whatever. And the problem is you're not doing any kind of intervention. There's no kind of randomization. And so let's take the example of red meat, for example. People who eat red meat may have higher rates of cancer, but they may also have other things that they're more likely to do, like less likely to exercise, more likely to smoke, drink alcohol. When you look at, red meat intake, a lot of it comes from processed foods. So they're probably not eating the healthiest forms of red meat, and just not having the overall healthiest diet. And so we call these confounding variables. And it's very hard to statistically pick out for these confounding variables. And just on this particular topic, one great study that really highlighted this was a study by Maximov I think it was out of Alberta, Canada in 2020. And they did a cohort study where they were looking at, I believe it was cancer incidence with increasing intakes of red meat. And they did it increasing intakes of red meat, but also with increasing intakes of fruits and vegetables. And so what they found was that low intakes of fruit and vegetables, there was a much lower risk of cancer with a low intake of red meat compared to a high intake of red meat with a low intake of fruits and vegetables. But at high intakes of fruit and vegetables with lower high intakes of red meat, there was no difference in disease incidence. And so to me, that kind of highlights it's less about the fact these people are eating more red meat. It's more about the fact that it appears that a lot of people who eat red meat end up eating less fruits and vegetables. And it's actually that lack of fruits and vegetables that is a net negative on their health, not necessarily the fact they're eating more red meat. And so again, it's difficult to disentangle all these when you go into long cohort studies, which is really one of the only ways to kind of look at long-term outcomes. So yeah, trying to design these scientific studies, and that's why I always say, like, when it comes to this stuff, I try to look at the body of evidence and say, what does the body of evidence, really show? So when it comes to red meat and cancer incidence, I'll say I think if it makes a difference, it's very, very little difference. And I think based on the data I've seen, I don't think it really makes much difference at all if people aren't overeating energy and they're still eating enough, fruits and vegetables and getting enough fiber. But because the research results are so all over the place and the differences in risk are so small. But if you look at something like dietary fiber, for example, from fruits and vegetables, good luck finding a study that doesn't show increasing fiber intake to also improve risk, reduce risk of cardiovascular disease, cancer, those sorts of things. And it's a very consistent effect.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to something like that, I feel much more confident saying, hey, this appears to be a real effect just because we see it so consistently.
Okay. Love that all. Except I think this fiber intake is basically a correlation or a proxy for people eating whole foods and better diets and focusing on health. So what do you think about that? That it's not, I mean, I fiber is good for satiety. It basically means you're eating foods in their whole form. And so, yes, people who eat more red meat and also eat more fruits and vegetables, that's basically meaning they're eating less trash. So, what do you think about it from that perspective? That I know out of the US, there's only, I don't know, like less than 1% of people that I think eat meat in the context of a healthy diet. The people like I hang out with, I'm here in Austin, it's a lot of people, super healthy crowd. People is blown away when they see this crowd. They're eating tons of red meat. They're eating whole foods only, basically, and they're not eating the processed foods. This is like a very different cohort. And also, I don't think that fiber is magic for health. It's fine. I get it. I know how it feeds the gut microbiome. I know that it you're getting food in their whole form and all that type of stuff. I just think it's mainly that people who eat more fruits and vegetables eat less processed foods.
I mean, it's possible. It's certainly possible that that's part of it. I think where I become somewhat more convinced is you see a very dose dependent response in these research studies where as it increases you see corresponding decrease in risk, typically in a situation you're talking about, which is essentially healthy user bias. With that sort of thing, you'll see kind of wonky associations where there's not really a dose response,
But
and it usually is not very consistent across studies.
no, but it is a
Now,
dose response. I'm saying that is exactly, it's math. It's that if they're eating more dose of fiber, fruits and vegetables, they have to mathematically be eating less of something else.
it's very possible. I'm people have asked me like, okay, could I just take a fiber supplement and just take that all day?
Oh,
I don't know. I think it's probably better than nothing. But I think certainly, you know, there could be something to Mother Nature's kitchen where it's not just only the fiber you're consuming. It's also the fact that, if you're eating a lot of fruits and vegetables, there's other micronutrients in there that may be beneficial. There could be specific fiber types that are, because fiber is not just one kind. Even amongst
mm-hmm,
soluble and insoluble fibers, there's many different types of
mm-hmm.
fiber. So it could also be very, very possible that there are specific fiber types that are actually more beneficial than others. Unfortunately, we're not deep enough into this literature to really know that. And absolutely, if people eat more of one thing, they tend to eat less of another. So they're absolutely, I think it's one of these things where, all these things can be true. It's not necessarily mutually exclusive,
Yeah.
which is, I mean, basically you could make the same argument for meat, for example, right? Like if they're eating more whole, lean cuts of meat, they're eating less sources of
Empty
other
calories. Yeah,
food.
yeah. They're eating at less empty calories. I think
Right.
a lot of it is just like empty calories. And I just call that like basically fat or carbs. There's a lot of empty calories that
For
are
sure.
causing people to overeat. Or it's like, okay, the fiber supplement is a good example. That doesn't help at all. If someone's eating 3,000 calories per day and they're just eating just just random, assorted processed foods or junk foods or whatever you want to call it, and then they just add fiber, that doesn't do anything because they're still overeating calories or and under eating protein, right? So, but if
I mean,
someone,
it's probably, I'll put it this way, it's probably better than not taking anything at all, but I wouldn't consider it good,
well, yeah, it's not like for fat loss. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Fat
yeah,
loss,
yeah.
yeah. So we should talk about it because I don't want to run out of time because it's super interesting to me. fat loss specifically, and the protein to nutrient ratio, and just like overeating calories. And why do people overeat calories? I think the biggest question for me is why, though. It's like someone just saying, oh, you ate more calories than you burned. That's meaningless, right? Use
Yeah.
your financial example. Oh, how to become rich? Oh, eat, spend less money than you make. Doesn't
Sure.
help you, right? So it's like,
Right.
how do we help people? So I think your take is kind of like most of the benefits come from the fat loss. So whatever the diet, which I agree with a lot of this, that whatever diet you can adhere to, if you're getting your nutrients and eating less energy so that you can lose fat, you can get tons and tons of benefits just from the fact that you're losing the fat. Basically, you're not that energy toxicity is a great term that you mentioned. Is that and visceral fat too? Like I like to talk about
Yeah.
between subcutaneous visceral fat. Like if you're cutting down your visceral fat in your liver too, I think it's so liver focused. I'm throwing a lot of things right now, but like you can get liver fat like very quickly from drinking alcohol, eating processed foods, specifically overeating energy and that has a lot to do with I think your metabolic health. But I just don't want to like be like that's all it is. I just don't think that that's all it is. It's all about just fat loss. I still think I'm throwing too much stuff at you right now, but there's still other things. It's like, why is our testosterone dropping? Like, it's insane how it's dropping. And going back, it's like, okay, don't drink out of this container. I think there's something to this stuff. I don't want to drink out of plastic. I don't want to like have a hot water bottle that's sitting in the sun for 10 hours and then drink that water bottle. I don't know. Maybe I'm an idiot. Maybe I'm getting less plastics in my diet and less estrogen and less stuff. And maybe, I just want to disentangle all these things. And I agree, so much of it has to do with fat loss, but I don't like throwing it as like, that's it. That's all it is. Do whatever you want, like drink, just go, just drink pesticides, like dump, anything on anything. So go for it.
Um, yeah, I mean, is it possible? Sure. I'm very, again, I think it's the messaging, which is it possible some of these things make a difference? It is possible. I think what I would say, like specifically with regards to testosterone, based on the decrease we've seen, if you look at the differences in testosterone of somebody who is obese versus lean on average, you see a pretty big difference.
Yeah.
And so I do think you can explain a lot of that. Maybe not all of it. It's possible. But again, I'm thinking about big rocks. Now, if somebody says, I don't want to drink out of plastic containers, okay, cool. Like, absolutely. Now, if you ask me, like, do I feel confident saying, hey, plastic is contributing to the decrease in testosterone? I don't feel confident saying that because I just don't think the research literature is very clear on that.
Yeah.
Um,
It's hard
but
to know
again,
though.
like,
But
if
yeah, I would
what
just
was
say
that?
it's hard to know. I mean, I'm not confident either way anyway, but I'm just saying, I don't
Yeah.
know. We have 20, 30-year studies on, I don't know. We're never going to know. I just have to assume
Yeah.
it's
So
not good.
I think again, if I tell people like, hey, if you as an again, this boils down to more like, what do you want to do versus what people are telling other people they should do, and I think that that's a distinct difference. And you know, if somebody says, hey, I just want to do everything I can, I don't care if this doesn't make a difference, I'm just doing it because it feels better for me, I feel more comfortable with it, absolutely. But then what I typically see is people go, like, let's take the plastic thing for example. Well, buy my new glass bottle or BPA free,
Mhm.
thing for $30. And so that for me it's like, okay, if you're creating some fear around something and then you're selling something based on that, to me, I do have a little bit of a problem with it. Not saying like you particularly, I'm just saying
Mhm.
in general. Um, but I think again, whatever people want to do is fine. I get pretty sticky when people come to like throwing around words like proven, research shows,
Mm.
these sorts of things. I'm gonna be pretty sticky when I call people on that. Now, do I think that there's possible environmental factors that have affected testosterone over the years? Sure. Do I think it's all fat loss? Absolutely not. I mean, we do know that there are some other things that make a difference. I will say, when you look at just how many people are overweight or obese, and how powerful the effect is of them going from obese to lean, again, that's where I tend to focus my energy on, because I think it's going to be the biggest bang for a buck. And a great example of that, just to show how powerful fat loss is, there was a professor at K-State named Mark Halb. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he was
Yeah.
they called him the Twinkie diet
Yeah. Yeah.
professor. And he did this as just an experiment for his class.
Yeah.
But he basically he called it the 7-Eleven diet, which basically he ate all processed food, but he capped it at 1,800 calories a day, took a multivitamin and mineral, and I believe he took a fiber supplement. I could be wrong on that. And he lost 27 pounds. All of his blood markers improved. His insulin sensitivity improved. All these things improved. And so now, was it the best thing he could have possibly done? No. Does he recommend other people do that? No. But the point being is that when you lose 27 pounds of body fat, like for the most part, you'll get a lot of resolution in a lot of your health markers. Are there other things you can do? I think probably yes. But again, it's one of those things where I'll tell people, like, these things aren't mutually exclusive, right? Like we can still work on all these different things at the same time.
Oh
So
yeah.
I think that's where the difference in messaging can be.
All right. No, I love that. I've talked about the Twinkie diet for years and years and years, and it's just it kind of proves some points in a different way too. It's like this. It's also like long term. Like no one thinks this is good for long term health, and that it was a cool experiment, and I get it. And but it kind of proves it. Well, doesn't prove anything, but the satiety aspect. So like, what do you think was going on with this guy? Like, of course, you can do anything for a short term, but yeah, let's
Yeah,
get.
and he said, like, hey, I wouldn't recommend this because, you know, at a certain he said he wasn't like crazy hungry, but he did say, like, there were points where I, like, man, I would just go for a big salad right now, or some
Yeah.
lean cuts of meat or something like that. He would feel better with that. So yeah, I think that people hear these stories and their interpretation is, well, this person's promoting a all junk food diet, or that's the way to lose fat, or no. The point is that if you're in an energy deficit, you will lose fat, regardless of how you get there. But that doesn't mean that that is the way to do things, the way
Mhm.
he did it. And I don't think there's any nutritionist or dietitian or evidence-based person who would ever recommend anyone start it that way.
Yeah.
But it was interesting to see that all these quote unquote like bad foods that everybody should avoid, that if you capped the energy,
Yeah.
you were
Well,
still
okay.
able to see improvements in his health
Yeah,
markers.
that's fine for short term, but then it leads into like the protein and stuff. And my problem with calorie counting is that if you just eat less of the same bad foods, you're just going to eat even less protein and nutrients. And it's
Yeah,
like,
we're on the same page there. I
yeah,
mean, I think a higher protein diet. I mean, I don't want to be dogmatic about it. It doesn't have to be crazy high. I mean, I think getting up to 1.4 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight is a really great start for a lot of folks, and will get 90% of those benefits. If you like more protein, I have yet to see compelling evidence that protein is bad for you, and you'll get people like Walter Longo and whatnot who will do enough torturing of the data to show what they want to show, and that's their perspective. Um, but I've never seen good evidence that protein is harmful, especially if you're eating an overall healthy diet. So, and there's some real benefits to protein. You mentioned the satiety is
mhm,
absolutely that's been pretty well established. Um, the thermogenic effect of protein,
mhm,
that's a little bit less established in terms of an actual fat loss perspective. But then also the fact that we know that higher protein diets help with the retention of lean mass during caloric restriction,
exactly.
and that is a really big deal. Like, being able to retain lean mass is a very, very big deal. I'm not even talking about people being bodybuilders and whatnot, but if you look at, sarcopenia and the progressive loss of muscle after age 40, if you look at, I believe the statistic is, and again, 90% of statistics are made up on the site, but I believe the statistic is after age 65, over half, over half of deaths can be attributed to some form of muscle wasting or weakness. And so when you look at like people who fall and break their hip, a lot of focus gets put on bone health and bone density, But if they never fell in the first place because they had the strength to prevent themselves from falling or the balance to prevent themselves from doing so, they wouldn't have broken that bone. And we know elderly people, once they break a bone or go into hospital, many, many times they don't come out of it. So,
Mhm.
I'm not just thinking about this from a bodybuilding, like, meathead
Yeah, yeah,
perspective. I'm thinking about this as like muscle is actually your most important organ for like longevity and health. And so,
100%.
having enough protein is it's not as important as actually engaging in physical activity and resistance training. Those things are more important, but it definitely makes a difference. And so I think for that, it is very much worth considering, trying to get in more protein into a person's diet.
That's huge. And yes, I encourage everyone lifting weights, like resistance training is so huge. And cardio is not really going to do that. If you're doing steady state cardio, that's not helping your muscle growth and all that. But I love that you brought that up. I wanted to bring that up. I'm thinking of a specific study. It was like college age females, and they did different, I think they used DEXA scan where they did different diets with protein, and they did a similar like weightlifting regimen. And one group with lower protein and one group with adequate or higher protein, they both lost the same amount of weight on the scale, but the low protein group lost tons of body muscle, right? They lost like
Yeah,
a significant amount of muscle, and the group with adequate or high or whatever it was like 1 pound. It was like very small amount of muscle and mostly fat. Huge,
yeah.
huge thing.
No, we do see that, and there was research out of the lab I was in. I wasn't involved in the study, but my PhD advisor, Dr. Layman, Dr. Don Layman, they did I believe it was like over a year study in women, and they saw that when they shifted from a like lower protein diet to a higher protein diet, they went from about a 65% of weight loss was from fat, 35% was from lean. In the high protein diet, it was more like 80-20. So 80% was from fat and
Hmm.
20% was from lean. So, like, literally, just with that little tweak, I mean, your weight loss is very similar, but your fat loss, which is, I think, what most people hopefully care about, I mean, you're getting extra fat loss for the same, maybe basically eating the same amount of calories.
Yeah.
So it's still energy balance because the weight loss is still the same, but you can change where some of that energy is liberated from.
That's such a huge point. This is one of the biggest points because I think this kind of just not debunks, but shows that so many diets are not good because, or maybe we don't even know that they're not good because we don't know how much muscle they're losing. And that so many diets, they're just like, yeah, just eat fewer calories. And I think that's just so bad to just do that in a like general sense, right? It doesn't help you,
I
right?
think you made a good point earlier, and I use this all the time, which is, what do you need to do to save money? Earn more than you spend.
Yeah.
Right? For most people, the more modifiable of those two outcomes is their spending, right? So let's take their spending and equate that to somebody's caloric intake, like their intake.
Hmm.
Um, just telling people, hey, eat less, it's, I mean, it's not really that helpful. It's like telling people spend less money.
Yeah.
Like, what would you do, if you were somebody who was into finance? Well, you would take a look at somebody's expenses and say, okay, where are some low hanging fruit here where we can cut things? Like, okay, you're subscribed to all these different things that you only use them, once every 6 weeks. Let's start getting rid of some of those, right? Oh, here's where I don't know, you're driving a little bit out of your way. You don't need to do that. Like,
Mm.
let's consolidate some of this stuff. So here's you're eating out, you're having Uber Eats, let's eat at home.
Hmm.
There's low hanging fruit of ways to start saving more money, just like there's low hanging fruit ways to start cutting more calories out of your diet, because these are dietary behaviors, just like spending is spending behaviors. I think a lot of people believe that, like, for example, obese people, if they are eating, a slice of pizza, that they're having like a cognizant, like, in their mind, like, okay, I know this slice of pizza is bad for me, but I'm going to eat it anyway because I don't mind being fat. No, they're probably just like, hey, Tuesday is pizza night, and that's the day I eat pizza, and that's what I do.
Yeah.
Like, this stuff gets so ingrained into how we spend our time. I mean, there's a reason, for example, that Like, and I'm not equating food to necessarily alcoholism, but if you look at like alcoholics who recover, they have to change their entire lives. Like, they can't go to the same places, they can't hang around the same friends. If you're wanting to change your intake and change your dietary habits and behaviors, you have to change your habits and behaviors. You can't just band-aid over it.
So huge. This is such a big part of it. And people I know have done this. And this is like one of the most effective ways for long-term success is like changing your surroundings. Because food is so much more than just calories or macros or anything. It's like, yeah, I've heard you talk about this before, but I talk about this nonstop. It's behavioral, it's societal, there's these norms. Yes, Tuesday's pizza night. Like so many things are just habits, what's around you. Like it's so hard to disentangle it. You can have all the information in the world, but you're still like, well, I'm sad and I'm going to eat like 10 bowls of ice cream. Like what?
Exactly.
Well, I
No,
don't
that's
know how
exactly.
to stop it. It's like, yeah, I mean, you have to have an entire change in your
No, that's right. And even like right down to like you sit down to watch a show. Oh, now it's snack time. Like it's just. When was the last time you went to some kind of function, like when was the last time you went to some kind of social gathering, even if it's for work, where there wasn't food available?
Yeah.
Like it's so ingrained into our culture, and so I think that's why I try to like get people with a little bit more flexible mindset, just because like the idea that you can completely control all your surroundings is really difficult. You can set yourself up for success, i.e., if you live in a home, don't keep a bunch of junk food easily accessible in your home, you know.
Hmm.
But when you go out, you'll probably get exposed to it at a certain point. So for me, it's all about set yourself up for success, ingrain good habits and behaviors, but have a flexible enough mindset that you can be around this stuff and not lose your mind on the odd occasion that you do have something off plan.
Well, yeah, and well, just there's also different types of people. This is like sort of a lot of stuff people talk about in the nutrition space. Some people need to abstain. Some people can do it in moderation. Just know yourself, and yeah, people are different, and yeah, some people might have to just be like alcoholic, like I'm never going to drink again, and that's the way to work because they can't just like have a few sips, like it's just not going to work for them. So I appreciate that. What about so I'm really into the why though, right? Like why do people overeat calories? No one wants to be fat and sick, yet we've ended up here. And why do you think that happened? And it especially like upticked around 1980. Like I pushed back a lot against the Seco people, like calories in, calories out type of thing, because I'm like, well, what changed? Like everyone just decided to be a gluttonous slob all of a sudden in 1980. Like, yeah, like what is your take on that?
I mean, I think it's pretty clear. Like, one, you had people like this is kind of the inflection point of where jobs really shifted to being much more as the advent of the personal computer became much more ubiquitous. People became much more sedentary because most work could be done seated or with minimal effort, right? Minimal physical effort. Back in the day, even if you were I don't know, let's take somebody like in a hospital or something like that. You've got a client file. You can't just email it over to somebody or text it over
Mm.
to somebody. You had to walk the file over somewhere. You know what I mean? So like right down to that little bit of stuff. And then, as you mentioned, just the plethora of ultra processed, cheap, readily available foods. So even 50s, 60s, 70s, you could get ultra processed food. You get cakes and cookies and all that kind of
Mhm.
stuff. But you would either have to like make them yourself or you had to walk down to the bakery. And so, one other aspect of this is you had these big chain grocery stores that started having everything available everywhere, right? So before, you would kind of have to like go to specialty shops. There'd be a lot more effort required, right? So think about if you wanted ultra processed food, if you had to drive somewhere to get it, or if you had to, go to a specialty shop to get it. It probably would decrease the rate of obesity in this country because a lot of people would just go, you
Yeah.
know what, I
Yeah.
feel like some Skittles, but I don't really feel like getting up to go get them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But now that you can, go to Walmart or whatever store you want, and a 7-Eleven right around the corner, and pretty much get everything you need. or everything you want, um, it's really no barrier to entry. So I really think that is the time when you just had these multiple variables kind of coming together. Yes, people are eating too many calories. Yes, they're not being active enough, but it wasn't a conscious decision by any means. It was simply our lifestyles changed and we didn't really realize it.
Yeah, yeah. But then, so then why? Like, I love to bring in the satiety aspect to this, and just the food supply on average. The food, like, that's why I'm a fan of the whole foods. It's like before, back in the day, people were kind of effortlessly thinner, right? Or like of normal body weight. The further back you go, because the average foods they ate had all the protein and nutrients they needed without all the excess fat or carbs, right? If you just look at it mathematically, it's like, okay, what do people eat generally? What's available? Okay, they had like meat and potatoes. Great. That's a good diet. That generally has the protein and nutrients you need and not too much extra energy. There's no like refined energy being dumped on it. I think around 1980s it hit like an all-time high of extra energy, refined energy, fat or carbs dumped in on everything, diluting protein and nutrients. And now just the average thing people are eating is just way lower in satiety, lower in protein nutrients, extra energy. These are all tied together. Why is something low satiety? Well, it has extra energy dumped in on it, right? It's like,
And I mean, like I use this example, like, with even with foods people consider healthy. Like let's take plant-based stuff, right? Well, plant-based has a healthy connotation. Well, you got plant-based mac and cheese that has just as many calories as regular mac and
yeah,
cheese, and it's like, well, it doesn't matter that it's plant-based. It's still ultra processed, not highly satiating, and easy to overeat. Well, then you can go to like ketogenic stuff, like hey, there's a right way to do keto and a wrong way to do keto, right? Like if you're focusing on, like basically the only carbohydrate you're consuming being from vegetables, and then like, some like some cuts of meat, fatty fish, those sorts of things. That's a great way to do it and great for satiety. But if you're going and getting like the keto halo top ice cream and eating an entire container of
yeah,
that, I mean, it's got more calories than the regular ice cream. Like you're
yeah.
you're, you're missing the point. Like this is still ultra processed and easy to overconsume. So I think that's where, like, I do think the if you have to make a blanket statement about what a healthy diet looks like, it can look like a lot of different things macronutrient wise, but typically it's yes, it's not having energy toxicity, but a lot of that can be facilitated through trying to minimize your intake of ultra processed foods.
Yeah. And to go back to Kevin Hall's study, there's two groups, and I think they switched them on the diets. And they had
Yes.
an ultra processed food and a minimally processed food. And the other group ate the processed food, ate 500 more calories. They gained 2 pounds more fat on average. On the other unprocessed diet, lost 2 pounds of fat. I don't know if it's fat or just weight on a scale, but it's just a great way to explain what goes on in natural settings. I think that's the main thing. I don't know 4.5 years ago if we were not on the same page, but it's like I'm so focused on the just natural, like doing things in natural settings or looking. You can't always capture this in studies. It's like, how do humans behave, right? It's like, well, we've seen how they behave. They're overeating calories for some reason, and that kind of explains it.
Yeah, I mean, we're not different there. I think, again, my focus has been like let's try and not like I just don't like people who use words like toxic or this and that. Even though I use the term energy toxicity, um, I just think we got to be careful with how we present these things. But in general, I don't think the advice is going to be much different from group to group, in terms of like, hey, if you want to reduce your calorie intake, you're probably better off eating like non-refined sources of fat and carbohydrate and trying to maximize your satiety, because if you're not as hungry, you're probably going to eat less. But the one caveat to that I would say is, hey, people don't always eat because of hunger either. They eat because of
Exactly.
stress, boredom, social cues, all different kinds of things. So it is important to understand that hunger definitely matters, but it's also not the only input.
That it's so important. And oh man, do you have to go? We just hit the time.
I can do a couple more minutes.
Okay, a couple more minutes because I just love this topic of Well, even like satiety per calorie. Have you like heard of that? Just the idea that like foods have a different satiety per calorie. Like to me, protein foods, whole foods, any food, any whole food has a satiety that equals the caloric, amount in it. But then there's certain foods that have almost no satiety for their caloric value, like a soda. Well, that's not going to keep you full, but it has tons of calories. What do you think of that as sort of like this general model of like what goes on and why people overeat when they don't want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can certainly explain a lot. You bring up a great, like, again, people misinterpret what I say. I say, well, if you equate calories, high fructose corn syrup doesn't appear to be more negative towards like liver health or these other things compared to like other sources of calories. But if you drink a soda, it's not like you go, well, that was 40 grams of carbohydrate, so I'm going to not have pasta tonight. No, people don't do that.
You're still
They
gonna
just
have
add it on
yeah.
top of their normal diet, right? So, again, I think it's one of those things where, you know, in general, it's a great framework trying to eat high satiety sources of food. I think in general, drinking calories in any form is a really bad idea. Um, and that can go for alcohol too. Um, Again, you can find studies where they equate calories and people have a few drinks per day and they show no difference in fat loss. And so that's fine. Like it's important to understand. But do I think it's a good idea to, you know, say, well, that means I can have a bottle of wine every night?
Hmm.
I mean, you can, but it's not going to leave room for a whole lot else. Like once factor in the calories from that. So, I think again, the framework of let's start with high satiety foods that are low calorie per gram or low calorie per amount of satiety you get is a great framework. Um, but also understand that hey, there's other inputs as well,
Mhm.
and it's important to have proper sleep, stress management, and also like staying mindful. I think that's a
Mhm.
big part of it as well. Like if you go to a social event, like one of the things I'll do before I go there is decide, am I going to eat anything? And I'm making a bigger deal out of this than
Mhm.
I really make it. It's not like I have a 5 minute conversation about every time I go to a social event,
Yeah.
but I'll kind of be like, okay, what level of restriction am I going to employ here? Am I going to be completely unrestricted and just do whatever? Usually I don't do that because I do have goals of body composition. I compete where I need to maintain a certain weight. Um, but I'll say usually what I'll do is something like, well, you know what? I'll have like a plate full of food and then I'll stop,
Mhm.
something like that. Or if I'm really, really close to a competition, I may bring a food scale with me just because, hey, I'm closer to a competition. I got to be a little bit more refined. Um, but I'm mindful about the conversation I have with myself about like, hey, how am I going to handle this sort of thing? Because in those situations it's so easy as you're around other people, as you're in a certain context, to just continue to eat and
Mhm.
eat and eat and eat and really not understand how much you've actually eaten.
Mhm.
So I think that's the other takeaway I would have for people is like just be mindful of your situation and surroundings as it relates to your food environment and how you approach food.
Absolutely. And there's so many other reasons people eat. They eat because they're sad. They eat because they're bored. They eat in general. When I go on trips with people, I'm not even hungry, and people are like, "Oh, let's go eat again." It's like here's the next meal. So I get it. I would a good trick, a sort of satiety hack too, is like if you're gonna go to an event, just eat like protein foods and satiating foods, and then maybe you won't be continuously eating chips for 2 hours, right?
Yeah.
Just set yourself up for success too. The satiety stuff for me, it's not like the end all be all because I know there's other reasons people eat. But if you set yourself up for success, you're full, then you're less likely to snack. I haven't snacked in years and years and years. I have no desire to snack because I'm full.
Yeah. And that actually is one pretty thing they see systematically is that people who are able to lose weight and keep it off, they don't really do much snacking,
Hmm.
mostly because snacking doesn't really have a big effect on satiety,
Hmm.
and people don't recall it when they do food recalls. They forget that they grabbed a handful of chips that was actually an extra 200 calories, or a handful of nuts that was an extra 300 calories. Like they don't account for that, and that's one of the big reasons people say, "Well, I'm not eating that much and I can't lose weight." It's like,
Hmm.
no, you actually ate a lot more than you thought you did. It just didn't register because it wasn't in an actual meal. We remember our meals. We don't
Yeah.
remember our snacks.
And just to put a cap on that, yes, like I would eat the exact same size dinner if I had those chips as a snack or not. It's not like, oh man, I magically
Correct.
ate 300 calories less for my dinner. It's like, no, I'm just gonna eat the same size dinner. So I love that.
Correct.
Yeah, less snacking. Few. Yeah. All right, I'm gonna let you go because we could go on forever. Good stuff. Yeah, just throwing in like you're not. I just forgot to mention this. You have like an app that helps people lose weight. Have low carb in your app. It's like you have all the ways. Not that I'm even low carb. That was like my first stage back in the day. But I like that. Yeah, you're just open to the different ways of people, allowing them to choose based on their preferences, their whatever, to do this. And there's lots of ways to do it.
Yeah, we don't try to funnel anybody. The app's called Carbon Diet Coach, and we don't try to funnel anybody into any particular way of eating. Our thing is like, hey, we'll give you the tools, and then you can pick, your own personal dietary preference of what you like, and we'll give you the tools to be able to unpack that. Um, but yeah, I think that knowing what we know about the research literature out there, it's more like let's provide the framework and allow people to choose whatever allows them to have best adherence over time. And that even applies to like meal frequency and things like that. Like you can have whatever meal frequency you really want on our app, and we don't pigeonhole you. So, by providing that flexibility, I feel like we can serve more people. But yeah, the funny part is, of any dietary preference, we actually have two low carb settings. We have like low carbohydrate, and then you're like kind of hardcore, like ketogenic,
Mm-hmm.
settings. So we don't have two settings for plant based. We don't have two settings for low fat. So I always tell people like, how could I be anti low carb when it's the only
Mm-hmm.
thing that I've got two settings on for my app?
Yeah, I like it. All right. Well, yeah, this is what we're doing in the film that we're going to grab you in Denver. I showed you the intro. So do you think we're kind of on the right track there?
I'll have to see the film. We'll see if it's debunk proof.
Okay. We're this is gonna be fun. But yeah, like I said, we could go on forever, but I think you're gonna have some good stuff on some of these nuances we talked about, and we want to get those in the film. And yeah, camp no camp. That's what I'm trying to be in. Over the years, I've gone less and less into any camp, and I think that's one way to not be able to be debunked easily. Uh, Good stuff. See you soon, and thanks, man.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Appreciate the time, man.
All right, see ya.
Cool. Thanks, dude.